Hi, I'm Dr. Anthea Rhodes, paediatrician here at the Royal Children's Hospital and your host today on the Kids Health Info podcast. Well, vaping, smoking, even oral nicotine pouches. There's so many different ways that kids these days can access nicotine products. But how harmful is it really, and what can we do if we're worried about them perhaps being dependent on these things? Joining us today on the podcast is a regular, Dr. Moya Vandeleur, our respiratory specialist here at the Children's Hospital. Thanks so much for coming along, Moya.
Thanks for inviting me, Anthea.
From the Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne, this is the Kids Health Info podcast.
So nicotine is out there in all kinds of products. It's not just a matter of, having a cigarette and kids hiding down behind the shed these days. It's much more complicated. Talk us through the different products that we see today and how kids are using them.
Nicotine is a chemical. It's a stimulant and it comes from the tobacco plant, and it can be found in a variety of products. So firstly, there's the products that can be smoked or inhaled, such as traditional tobacco cigarettes, e-cigarettes, also known as vapes, cigars, shisha, those sort of products. And then we have the other style of nicotine product, which is not smoked or inhaled, and this includes nicotine pouches, which are small sort of tea bag like products that you put between the lip and the gum, and you absorb the nicotine through the oral mucosa. We also have snus, which is a product that contains tobacco as opposed to just the nicotine. And because of that, it's dark coloured and it can actually stay in your teeth. And then there are nicotine gummies, which you actually swallow.
So there are a range of different nicotine products. Are any of these healthier than others?
There is no healthy nicotine product. There is a difference between the side effects, but there is no healthy dose of nicotine for the human body.
I think it's really important to set that record straight for parents because it's really easy to be misled and confused about that. And so these things are out there now, and a recent study we did on the Child Health Poll certainly suggested that, in fact, vapes and e-cigarettes among teenagers are the most common type of product, but cigarettes are still being used quite frequently as well. And then these oral pouches that you talked about, which I've heard recently the term of like an upper decky, so you sort of park it up under your gum and that's where the nicotine is being absorbed. Those sorts of things, of course, can be used in all kinds of environments, including a classroom, for example, because, as you say, there's no smoke or vapour. So young people are using lots of different products. Why is it a worry?
The reason nicotine is unsafe is it's a highly addictive substance, and particularly in young people, they're particularly vulnerable to the effects of nicotine. So we know that young people can use smaller amounts and less frequently and become addicted or dependent on it. And there are lots of harmful effects of nicotine, both in the short term and the longer term. And kids are being taught about this in school, but it's hard to know how much of it sinks in. In terms of the shorter term impacts of nicotine, it can cause trouble with memory, trouble with concentration. We know that it also can affect mood, making children and teenagers more likely to feel anxious. It can disturb their sleep.
Parents might be listening to some of those things, mood, them feeling anxious, not sleeping well. How can parents sort of pick whether this might be related to nicotine use in their young person, given how common it is, or whether it might be from something else?
I think that's really tricky without asking, because obviously we know that a lot of teenagers have issues with sleep. About half of teenagers don't get enough sleep. Mental health concerns in young people are also common. So I think the key message to parents are if there are any concerns in any of these areas, it's really important to talk to your teenager.
And it's not always easy to bring these sorts of things up. What tips do you have for parents about how they might raise the topic of whether or not their young person is maybe trying some of these products?
Sometimes the young person will raise it with their parent, but I think, opportune times are, for instance, if there's been a movie and there's someone vaping or smoking, or even walking down the street is probably more common, and having that conversation with a young person in an open way and, listening in a non-judgmental way to what the young person knows about e-cigarettes. Maybe it's just a conversation about whether anyone they know has used e-cigarettes, and then it can move on, depending on the circumstance, to what the young person's ideas are about trying it.
And interestingly, in the recent poll that we did where we talked to parents and teenagers, among those teenagers who tried some sort of nicotine product, which was about a quarter, less than half of them had a parent that knew about it. So then when we asked the parents, more than half of the time the parents said, no, my child's never tried any of these things, or they said, I don't know. So it's really common, I guess, for teenagers to be taking risks, and, that's what's normally going to happen in adolescence. And from the data, we know that often that might include trying some sort of nicotine product. But clearly there are risks. It is highly addictive. So having that conversation with your teenager to try and help them understand and, I guess, flag when there might be problems is really important. So why is it in particular that for teenagers nicotine is concerning when it comes to how it affects the brain?
We know that when you inhale nicotine, or when you absorb it from your mouth, the nicotine travels in the blood and goes to the brain, and there's a release of chemicals, and the young person will feel alert and perhaps
have that rush
pleasure,
rush
type of feeling.
Yeah.
And we know that with regular use, you can become dependent. The body becomes, there are cravings, this sort of thing. People often think about, if you're using an e-cigarette or a cigarette, the sort of cough and that sort of thing, but that's more with inhaled products. Over time, with longer-term use of nicotine, you put your body at higher risk of, having cardiovascular, higher blood pressure and, other sort of health harms sort of in a more chronic way.
And is it true that if a young person is exposed to nicotine, so a teenager using it versus for the first time versus an older person, that the chances of dependence can be higher?
What we know is that young people's brains can be rewired almost. And, if you become addicted to nicotine, we also know that you're more likely to become addicted to other substances. So I think those risks have to be acknowledged and part of the conversation.
And what about the sort of risk to do with second-hand exposure? So particularly thinking about cigarette smoking and now with vaping and e-cigarettes, what's the risk there?
There's really solid evidence confirming the harms of passive smoking or second-hand smoking. And we know that the same negative health impacts of actually smoking yourself can be transferred to someone else when you're regularly smoking around them. And that's evidenced by, if you're in a room with someone who's smoking, you might cough yourself. So you can, that's something that's easy to understand. With e-cigarettes, we think there's those same sort of risks. So the aerosol that's released when you use an e-cigarette can also be inhaled by whoever else is in the room. And, it's often talked about that e-cigarettes we know they've been around for a lot less time. And so some of that sort of scientific data and scientific studies confirming the health impacts, perhaps, the evidence isn't as strong, but we, in the medical profession, we're convinced that secondhand exposure to aerosols from e-cigarettes will be just as harmful. There are some really interesting studies involving animals that show that even third-hand e-cigarette exposure, which is the idea that if there's been e-cigarette use in a room and there's aerosol that covers certain
a surface
in the room. If an animal's skin comes into contact with that, they absorb nicotine and some of the chemicals. And, there's every reason to think that the same would be the case if a child is exposed to third-hand e-cigarette aerosol on surfaces in that way. And it's really important, therefore, to recognise that using vapes in a car, for instance, which is a confined space, it is actually against the law to vape with a child in the car, but we know that there'd be, dangers associated with that idea of third-hand exposure to vapes and e-cigarette aerosol.
Yeah, the car is one of those situations that's really important for parents to be aware of, and I guess groups of young people in a car together as well are at the same risk.
Yeah.
And what about actually ingesting nicotine, Moya? So, for example, vape liquid or vape juice. I know we've had situations with very young children where there's been really tragic outcomes from that.
Yeah, it's really important to recognise that if a child or an adult swallows nicotine liquid, it's a medical emergency. So there have sadly been cases of children having accidental access to vapes, ingesting nicotine and dying. So some of the common side effects or some of the common symptoms that a child might show would be nausea, vomiting, sweating, pallor, seizures. And if a child has any of those, or there's even a suspicion of access and ingestion to nicotine liquid, you should absolutely present to an emergency department with your child.
Yeah, really important advice for parents to be aware of, and of course a reminder that if these products are around, they do need to be kept in a safe place where they're out of reach of children. So for parents listening who might be thinking, I'm worried perhaps my young person has been using a nicotine product, maybe they're concerned about some of their behaviours, they're worried about dependence, what sort of advice have you got about where you can seek help?
I think any young person who is using e-cigarettes or cigarettes or another nicotine product are at risk of being addicted or dependent. So if a teenager is dependent on nicotine, they want to use their nicotine product within an hour of waking in the morning. They take their device with them wherever they are. Often they have cravings if they're not using it regularly. Perhaps they've tried to quit unsuccessfully before. So there are really clear ways of knowing that the teenager is dependent on nicotine. Perhaps they have symptoms of nicotine use, issues with mood, issues with sleep, issues with concentration and memory. Perhaps they have some physical symptoms. They're complaining of headache or some nausea that's unexplained, or that they talk about, when you're talking about using your device, that if they don't use it, they feel anxious and they have, issues with their sleep, and that it's really important just to have the conversation and find out what they're using, how they're feeling when they use it, and how they're feeling if they try to stop using it.
And interestingly, we found in the poll, and other research shows this too, is a lot of young people actually do want to quit or cut back.
Absolutely. Perhaps they've tried unsuccessfully to give up without support. And I think when you have those conversations and you hear those issues, it can be a really nice way then to talk to your teenager about getting some other supports and what that might look like. We know that young people want to have control over what's happening, so asking them what they need, is it that they'd prefer, for instance, to talk to a health professional one-on-one, like their GP, or they prefer to access some online resources or telephone support from Quitline, for instance. So there really are some excellent resources available to support young people. And what we do know is that if they are dependent on nicotine, the most successful quit attempt will involve or include both behavioural support, so what's going on at home and with their friendship group, and having those supports in place, perhaps some counselling, but also potentially the use of some nicotine replacement therapy. So medical professionals can prescribe medication that can help the young person deal with their cravings and with their withdrawal symptoms. So the data and our experience for those of us that work with young people is that if they have access to behavioural supports, but also medical supports like nicotine replacement therapy, they're more likely to quit successfully.
And what sort of form does that replacement therapy come in, Moya? That's different from a vape, for example.
Yeah, so it can be confusing because on one hand we're saying that vapes are not good for you, partly because they contain nicotine, but then we're replacing the nicotine. that conversation looks like, explaining that you're giving smaller levels of nicotine so that their cravings don't happen, and we're going to give it to you for a short period of time to help you get through, quitting the e-cigarette or cigarettes or pouch. And the type of form that it comes in, you can use nicotine patches, which allow for delayed release of nicotine over time, or short-acting nicotine. So that can be gummies, for instance, or lozenges. And that way the young person can actually use those in a more discreet way. Perhaps they're when they're at school, they can use a patch. They can use a lozenge in the same way that you might have a throat lozenge. So there's lots of different forms to help support young people to quit
through that weaning journey and then stopping altogether.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Moya. We've covered lots of really important elements there and lots of really practical advice, as always, for parents and families at home. And, of course, we've got the Kids Health Info fact sheets where we'll put the link in our show notes, and we've got a lot of that information in there, as well as links to some of the great resources that you've mentioned today. Thanks again for coming on for a chat. It's been fabulous.
Thanks, Anthea.
Information in this podcast is general in nature and is intended to support, not replace, discussions with your doctor or healthcare professional. If you have concerns about your child, please consult your local healthcare professional for individual advice. This podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders. Kids Health Info is funded thanks to the support of the Royal Children's Hospital Good Friday Appeal.